Boston, I feel sheepish that I haven't been down before, but it's beautiful down here, so I hope it's to be repeated. Aki has finished the clear part. Now we move to the much less clear part. If he gave a just so story, I'm going to give an imagined as if first pass at what possibly it might be if it were coherent. Okay, and there's an important conditional there that I shall not detach. Okay, so this work grew up because we worked on the paper as a result of looking at Gödel's philosophical notebooks, which have begun to be transcribed and shared from the Gabelsberger. We got into possession of the material from the first two of them, and we opened it up, and lo and behold, there was discussion of Russell. So this is very difficult material. It's a first pass, but I will give you my imagined reconstruction of what's there. There is some textual basis for what I'm saying. And of course, as Aki has explained, there's a mathematical and a logical basis for arguing that Russell, rather than Husserl, is the most important philosophical inspiration for Gödel. So I'm going to say a bit about the MaxPhil notebooks, the part that I've looked at, the draft transcriptions. None of this has yet been published. I'll give you an overview of Godel and Russell with respect to philosophy and some of the questions that have actually already been asked by Jared and Marcus about truth and Platonism. I'm going to have a brief couple of remarks about what Godel thought about Turing. And then I will go through what I call the MRTJ, the multiple relation theory of truth, which is the theory of truth for the base case, the atomic case in Principia, which Godel also studied in the passages that immediately follow the ones that Aki was analyzing from Principia in the last talk. Then I will give some history at the end about Godel with Russell. Okay, so the MaxPhil notebooks, there are 14 of them that exist. They're up. The images are posted on the Institute for Advanced Study website, but of course they're in Gabelsberger shorthand, so you can't really use them. So there has been a large-scale project that has just begun. Now Gödel accepted the invitation to write Russell's Mathematical Logic, that essay with which Aki's lecture just ended, on 18th of November 1942, and he began MaxPhil 9 that very day. So we're talking about one of these philosophical notebooks, 9, and he delivered a draft of that paper very quickly, in just 6 months. He didn't always deliver drafts quickly. So this already is building on the fact that he knew Russell's work very well, and he knew pretty much what he wanted to say to Russell. He was extremely disappointed when Russell did not write a reply, as is the usual thing that happens in a Schlick volume. I think this was probably very devastating for Russell, because he'd been very speculative, as we saw at the end of that essay, about Leibniz and the dream of the concept theory, and it fell completely flat without a reply from Russell. Moreover, in Russell's autobiography, he later complained that Gödel was some kind of Platonist, and he really thought this was quite dubious, if not crazy. So it was a painful episode in the Schlick volume. But in any case, we have the notebooks here, MaxPhil 9 and the first part of MaxPhil 10, and I want to argue that Russell's philosophy is the most central focus of this, which is what one would expect if one knew the composition dates, but also the contents of these notebooks. Now, I should say, you know, notebooks, if you looked at my notebooks, you would not be well to spend much time with them. We all jot things down. So even sorting the topic of these are intense brainstorming remarks, okay? Some short, some a paragraph long. I counted them, 121 philosophical ones. He labels them himself. 97 grammatical remarks, 31 other remarks, sometimes on the effects of music, on politics, you know, the Marseillaise. So there's a lot of free association going on here. One has to work very hard to try to extract a theme, and this is really what my as-if story is attempting to do. Now, Russell's Mathematical Logic as an essay has been widely read, but as Aki has told us, it's a very difficult piece, and at the end it's very speculative, Charles Parsons, in 2010, noted in his essay on this that here Gödel did not rely on a notion of intuition, which of course, given Charles Parsons' interest in intuition in the philosophy of mathematics, he was struck by that because, of course, Gödel thought that in the end, to get the foundations of logic and math right, you had to go to metaphysics. You had to go somehow outside of mathematics to make sense of the foundations. So, going through MaxPhil, we see very few occurrences of intuition. The turn to Leibniz, which is mentioned at the end of the 1944 essay, only takes place in the second half of MaxPhil 10. So, the composition of the essay behind the scenes shows Gödel is imagining Russell, but he has not yet turned to him in the passages I'm going to analyze. And the turn to Husserl is after 1959. So the secondary literature on Gödel's philosophy has been, I think, unfortunate in either focusing on uncritical Platonism, crazy Platonism, just, we match the world Platonism, or in focusing on phenomenology. So part of the purpose of this investigation is to place Russell front and center as the philosopher he knew best, and the one who really shapes what could be argued to be a more critical form of Platonism. And here, I think Jared's was answered well by Aki mathematically, but I think there still remain questions about whether this is a critical form of Platonism. So I've tried to reconstruct here, based on what I know of Russell, what might be going on. The opening of MaxPhil 9, the very first page, begins like this. So this will give you a flavor of how difficult it is to interpret this material. I would say that only someone who'd spent years on Wittgenstein's remarks on math would have the stupidity or sense to be patient with things like this. But if I trust someone, I will work. First remark, nominalistic systems, perhaps fruitful if provable instead of true, then to contain analysis, question mark. From the possibility of negative being follows that of the being of a relation is a potentiality to the external world, and he italicizes potentiality. What do these two little pieces teach us? And Andrew is shaking his head. Indeed. All right, so I will exert strong interpretive efforts. My suggestion is that the first remark concerns proof, and the second concerns truth. And the notion of truth will involve potentiality of correspondence to the so-called external world, obviously a reference to Russell's external world. So, how to impose some order on this? By the way, that was only the first remark in the notebooks. It gets harder. So, truth. Use Russell to organize the work with, and philosophical remarks on truth and axiomatic method. On the potentiality of negative being, I'm going to suggest that this is a kind of correspondence theory of truth without propositions. Russell in Principia had eliminated the notion of proposition, as Aki has said. We instead have the notion of a propositional function. Russell had generated paradoxes in this substitutional period with the notion of proposition. So it's a view of correspondence without a notion of proposition doing the work, and the multiple relation theory of judgment, which occurs in Principia immediately after the passages Aki was analyzing for you, is the heart of it. Potentiality is added from the Tractatus. So as Stanford Shea has been arguing in numerous wonderful papers, Russell is a modal eliminativist. There's no notion of possibility or necessity in Russell's conception. The person who puts modality and potentiality into this fray is Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. So I want to argue that Gödel learned a bit from Wittgenstein about that idea of form being the possibility of structure, but he's still holding on to Russell, and he feels Russell was badly influenced by Wittgenstein in certain directions. Finally, for proof, I want to use some later remarks of Gödel's about Turing's work resolving the decision problem in the negative in his famous paper on computable numbers. There's an analysis of logic that Turing is giving us with the notion of a Turing machine, and I want to use that using Gödel's own words to characterize Gödel's understanding of proof. Now, Russell's an inquiry into meaning and truth. I must recommend to everyone in this department, you're so interested in truth. Okay, so this book is very unfashionable. But this was quite wonderful. This is the aging rock star who has come back to give the William James lectures. Carnap's in the audience, Quine's in the audience. You read this book and it looks on the one hand like a tissue of contradictions, and in another way it looks like a perfect agenda for philosophy of language over the next 2 decades. Every single issue is dealt with. So Gödel has this open before him while he's writing Russell's mathematical logic. It's clear from going through MaxPhil. He's quoting from it. So obviously what would he do? He was going to write for Russell's short volume, so he would look at an inquiry into meaning and truth because it was the latest statement of Russell's on his latest ideas. So we mustn't be anachronistic. We look back on this as not a terribly important or strong book, but for Gödel it was a very serious thing. And there are several features of the view that are of interest. First, the notions of meaning and truth, argues Russell, require a step into metaphysics contra Carnap and the logical positivists. Second, not every observable fact may be put into words. And he appeals to Gödel's arithmetization of syntax only at one point in his discussion. But he does it to show that potentially infinitely many possible statements may be made about a given experience. In other words, experience is rich relative to the potential linguistic articulation. So, given private experience is indeed private, but it is rich and it's not organized a priori according to one scheme. So when we have conscious awareness of experience for Russell, judgment requires analysis. And this is an older theme, reaching back to Principia, as I'll explain. He also argues that the hierarchy of languages is not Tarski's that he wants to endorse, but something quasi-psychologistic. It's a kind of primitive object language with which a child would start, based on what he calls solitary language, and then as the child progresses under the pressure of the environment, we see gradually emerging within the language a grasp of the notion of truth. You should think Quine, just there. So there's a kind of Cartesian impulse there in a quasi-Quinean picture. It looks like an agenda for what Quine would go on to try to do in word and object. Now, the MRTJ, the multiple relation theory of judgment, is one that Gödel studied many times. And we know this from the library slips out of the library. He may have come upon it as early as 1925. Remember, Aki said he was reading Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy then. But we know that by 1928, again, after writing the incompleteness paper, in 1932-4, and again in 1942-3. And what this involves, I want to argue, is a going down to the first step into truth. You've got to get the first step of the hierarchy right. If you get the base step right and work out a theory of concepts for that, the rest will be fine. You should think and echo with the Tractatus. In between, at each point, after he went downward to the base step, he would go upward to set theory. So there's a kind of upward and downward movement in his particular chronological way of thinking. And in set theory, the notion of set is given through axioms, of course. But for Gödel to repeat, the notions of truth and set must be analyzed in terms of more intentional notions. In this case, in the essay on Russell, in terms of what he says is the notion of concept. Now, Russell and Gödel sort of share a picture, I think, of what axiomatic method does for you in mathematics. First, simplicity and definability. And in definability here, we're talking about truth. We're talking about writing down a formula in one free variable corresponding to a class of true formulas at the lower limit. So simplicity and definability are ideally absolute. Axiomatic method, however, will be what delivers that absolute truth to you. And they think vertically. Upward to transfinite types, as Aki said, we have to have a comprehensive approach to truth, but downward to a theory of truth at the base level. And at that base level is the MRTJ. And that view, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go on, holds, as I say, primarily for the atomic point. Russell did go on later to try to develop an epistemology for more complex sentences, but he gave up on the epistemology for that. So it's important this is not a representational correspondence theory of truth. It's not that sentences or propositions represent reality. There are no Phrygian thoughts if we want to construe those as part of a representational view. This is common to Gödel and Russell. Now, Gödel is also dialectical. Okay? Another critical side of, I think, his gradual embrace of Platonism. Form and content are distinguished. He, like Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, distinguishes between form and content, but now in a new way, of course, not an Aristotelian way. Form means formal derivations or linguistic signs. Content means truth and conceptual complexes. And in application of the axiomatic method in proof, there is an ongoing dialectic and confluence between these two different standpoints. So that's what the two little pieces at the beginning of MaxPhil are supposed to show, is dialectic. Here's a further remark. Not every, but only certain forms, the fruitful and objectively existing ones, have a corresponding content through which they are to be understood. That is, that one can then commend that at a glance and in application. That which is content infused is, in a certain sense, the opposite of that which is formalized. Because there's this opposition. A board game is something purely formal, but in order to play well, one must grasp the corresponding content, the opposite of combinatorial. On the other hand, the formalization is necessary for control. Note, for only it is objectively exact. Therefore, knowledge is an interplay between form and content. This is his dialectical. For anyone who reads Wittgenstein on math, this is, of course, an absolutely fascinating kind of remark. Remark, philosophy. The ground of knowledge is never indicated as ground, right? It doesn't come labeled to you as a ground, but as one, either signs, indication, marks, or proof. Now this is interesting. Proofs are discovered, and he uses entdecken here. They're not discovered, but found or located, gefunden. Marcus can tell us what the German difference there would be. In contrast, definitions are set up, aufgestellt. In this way, one obviously thinks of nominal definition, which by means of abbreviation represents things with a complicated structure through something simple, which is indifferent for the structure equivalence is already destroyed. In other words, he's not interested in nominal definition. He's interested in definability relative to truth and something that will reflect conceptual reality. Now let's go to Godel and Turing. Gödel holds that Turing, in his paper on computable numbers, offered the unquestionably correct analysis of the notion of a formal system. And we're smiling because, of course, there's no such thing as an unquestionably correct analysis. If there is, name one. So, in any case, Gödel takes that as successful. 1. Turing's analysis of calculation in a logic does not depend upon any specific symbolic features of a particular formalism. So in a Turing machine, you can take any symbols you like. 2. Turing's parameter for a step is absolute. It holds robustly regardless of the strength of the axiom system you're in or the particular formal language in which you're working. 3. Turing's analysis of the general notion of formal system settles the precise scope of application of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, right? Because Gödel offered the incompleteness proof in 1931 relative to a particular system. How did you know there couldn't be another system? That might somehow defeat the arguments. Turing is the one who resolves the precise scope. And in fact, Gödel was inspired by Turing's absolute analysis of computability to later aim for absolute notions of definability and provability. This comes out in the 40s. Here he is in 1946 in the Princeton Bicentennial lecture. Tarski has stressed in his lecture, and I think justly, the great importance of the concept of general recursiveness or Turing's computability. It seems to me that this importance is largely due to the fact that with this concept, one has for the first time succeeded in giving an absolute definition of an interesting epistemological notion, i.e. one not depending on the formalism chosen. In all other cases previously, such as demonstrability or definability, one has been able to define them only relative to a given language, and for each individual language it's clear that the one thus obtained is not the one looked for. So, looking at a Turing machine as a philosophical thought experiment, we see, Gödel could analyze what a formal system is, because to do that you can't just write another formal system down. You have to do something different. And then you have to show that what you just did will code up any possible formalism of the relevant kind. For the concept of computability, however, says Gödel, although it is merely a special kind of demonstrability or decidability, the situation is different. By a kind of miracle, it's not necessary to distinguish orders, and the diagonal procedure does not lead outside the defined notion, because as we know, there are partially defined recursive functions. This, I think, should encourage one to expect the same thing to be possible also in other cases, such as demonstrability and definability. Now, Turing's analysis could be regarded as an analysis of the logical or deductive architecture involved in utilizing the axiomatic method. But Turing and Wittgenstein think horizontally, they don't think vertically. Inspired by Wittgenstein, and he was quite explicit about this, Turing thought horizontally. He leaned on types drawn from everyday language or everyday mathematical language. He analyzes logic in terms of its contribution to axiomatic method, in terms of ubiquitous step-by-step procedures and the universal machine. Then, when he wishes to try to incorporate a response to incompleteness, he works with oracles. Suppose you're delivered, something a Turing machine can deliver you, and then if you have that, you go up. For later Wittgenstein and Turing, I want to say simplicity is fluid. It's robust and necessary in analysis, but it's fluid. And logic is analyzed in terms of procedures and aspects of representations as articulated in everyday mathematical models of language. Carnap, I think, had a very different schematic picture of axiomatic method. He was invested in attempting to distinguish between kinds of truth, conventionalism. Is Turing's analysis a miracle? I would say no. Turing analyzes what a formal system of the relevant kind is by thinking through to the everyday, to what's done with the formal system. And I don't think that Gödel or anyone coming out of the Hilbert School would have done what Turing did. He was inspired to embark on that by reading Russell, again, Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, as Aki said, and probably he attended Wittgenstein's lectures in Cambridge 1932 to 34. Of course, the mathematical work was sparked by a course that Newman gave in the spring of 1935. So Turing also went very quickly to the undecidability result, about a year. People are puzzled about how he could do that so quickly. My answer is that he had already been engaged in reading foundational work as an undergraduate. So, it's important that Turing's analysis of this aspect of axiomatic method has certain features. First of all, neither the law of excluded middle nor truth are inextricable elements of our general notion of a human being following a step-by-step procedure in the relevant sense. And this is why it's no miracle that the diagonal procedure does not lead beyond itself. And in fact, at the heart of the argument given in uncomputable numbers is not the halting argument, which is the usual way that we show a Turing machine to resolve in the negative the question of whether there's a general procedure for determining whether a Turing machine in general will halt. We usually use the halting argument, but that argument uses negation. You build the contrary machine that goes down the diagonal and changes. If you look carefully at what Turing does, it's much more Wittgensteinian. There's no negation. He builds a machine that I call the do what you do machine. And in effect, the command structure turns up a command, something like a card that says, do whatever you're supposed to do right now. No negation. And you see, but you have to see, it can't do anything. So it's a positive argument. that resolves the decision problem. And Bernays noticed this and suggested when Turing added corrections to that paper that he utilize a Brauerian construction of the real numbers in order to make it very clear that this analysis is highly general. Okay. So again, Turing's analysis uncovers two essential features of the notion of provability, hence of axiomatic method more generally. First, procedures, step-by-step computable routines. Second, what I call the fluidity rather than the relativity of simplicity. So you might think that simplicity is relative to a system. This is something like Carnap's. Picture the middle Wittgenstein cult, this view of simplicity. But the fluidity is different. The fluidity is robust within an absolute notion, but you have parameters that can be moved, truncated, put inside one another, and so on. So analysis has a kind of absolute notion, but it's fluid. And incidentally, I do think that it was reading on computable numbers that led to Wittgenstein's own style of writing in philosophical investigations. He read that paper in exactly the point of time where the passages in the investigations on simples and the Theaetetus are written. And that style of writing comes into play exactly that spring. And he discussed the book with Turing in the summer of '37. So, this is... Now for Gödel, Turing had captured this formal part, which he wanted to distinguish from the contextual part. So he said again in 1963, in my opinion, the term formal system or formalism should never be used for anything but this notion as analyzed by Turing. In a lecture at Princeton in 1946, I suggested certain transfinite generalizations of formalisms, and again, Aki's giving you the flavor of why Gödel might have wanted to do that. But these are something radically different from formal systems in the proper sense of the term, whose characteristic property is that reasoning them, in principle, can be completely replaced by mechanical devices. Now notice that Turing here assumes that Turing is some kind of mechanist, assumes that Turing has a theory of mind. This is not so. Although the phrase state of mind occurs in Turing's paper, I would argue you can't prove mathematical theorems based on theories of mind. So I would argue that it's a much more appropriately Wittgensteinian, quasi-Fregean reading of Turing that is proper. But for Gödel, coming out of Russell, Turing was offering a theory of mind as well as a theory of formal systems. Okay, so now let's get to the MRTJ, and I'm going to start with where Aki left off, which is a picture of the proof of the consistency of the continuum hypothesis. You have this nice way in which Gödel's going to take the construction of L, first order definability, as the backbone of that universe. Take that as given. Then you imagine closing off under first order definability as you go up. And so you have the universe, and then if you imagine a set or a real number constructed up here above omega 1, he shows by the skull and pole argument that you can pull it down. It must have already appeared. Right? So we have kind of a relative consistency proof relative to these axioms, and there's kind of reflection going on here. And the picture is that we're going to take it as given, and then definability will catch up with what's given in some sense by being pulled in. However, what I'm going to focus on with the MRTJ in this picture is the bottom. That's where it has to come in, I think. We have to get to the simple, the first step, zero truth. And any axiomatic analysis involves a given, some data in Euclid's term, comprising that from which one begins. A Turing machine, for example, encodes simple signs and simple steps, but you have to see them as simple and take that and move with that. You'll employ common notions like identity as well. Of course, you have to recognize the same sign or the occurrence of a sign again. And axioms codify the most basic assumptions and concepts of a science. But in the end, even to formulate these, you have to begin with certain fixed elements or basic conceptual primitives. So let's go back to Principia and continue from the passages that Aki read you from in the previous lecture. In Principia, judgments of perception are not sense data. Instead, they are the particular judgments used to characterize the basis of Russell's informal recursive way of presenting the ramified hierarchy of truth and definability. So I want to argue that these judgments of perception serve a logical role. They erect the distinction between truth and falsity without postulating propositions as part of the metaphysical equipment of the system. So it's not merely sense data theory, which is the way usually this is read. And in Principia, though Russell had formulated this theory already by 1906, the first place he endorses it is in Principia in this introduction. So the classic example from fiction, though of course we're not supposed to only be talking about fiction, is poor Othello who wrongly judges that Desdemona loves Cassio. Now, there are several features of this theory. The idea is, first, there's no proposition involved. There's no sentence involved. There's no representation involved. What there is a judgment fact. And that judgment fact is complex. And that judgment fact is not two-place. So instead of a picture of a judger and a truth maker, or a judger and a proposition, or an attitude and a proposition, we break it up into more than two arity. Now, because Othello is wrong, what does it mean for Othello to believe wrongly or judge wrongly? This is a false judgment fact complex. It's because there doesn't exist another complex in which Desdemona is joined with Cassio in the loving relation. Right, so that's what my little peach circle over on the other side says. So there's no negative fact corresponding to a false judgment. We simply have an immediate account of the distinction between truth and false. And this theory has various advantages over the theory that Russell initially poses after reading G. Moore at the turn of the century. That was a dual relation. Here's Principia. The universe consists of objects having various qualities and standing in various relations. Some of the objects which occur in the universe are complex. When an object is complex, it consists of interrelated parts. Let us consider a complex object composed of two parts, A and B, standing to each other in the relation R. The complex object, A in the relation R to B, may be capable of being perceived. When perceived, it is perceived as one object. Attention may show that it is complex. We then judge that A and B stand in the relation R. Such a judgment, being derived from perception by mere attention, may be called a judgment of perception. This judgment of perception, considered as an actual occurrence, is a relation in four terms, namely A and B and R and the percipient. The perception, on the contrary, is a relation of two terms, namely A in the relation R to B and the percipient. Such an object of perception cannot be nothing. We cannot perceive A in the relation R to B unless A is in the relation R to B, right? I mean, obviously it's a success verb. You can't perceive what's not there. Hence, a judgment of perception, according to the above definition, must be true. This does not mean that in a judgment which appears to us to be one of perception, we are not sure of being in error, since we may err in thinking that our judgment has really been derived merely by analysis from what was perceived. But if our judgment has been so derived, it must be true. In fact, we may define truth where such judgments are concerned, this is a truth definition, as consisting in the fact that there is a complex corresponding to the discursive thought, which is the judgment. That is, when we judge A has the relation R to B, our judgment is said to be true when there is a complex A in the relation R to B, and said to be false when this is not the case. This is a definition of truth and falsehood in relation to judgments of this kind. That is, when we say or judge this is red, what occurs is a relation of three terms, the mind and this and red. On the other hand, when we perceive the redness of this, there's a relation of two terms, namely the mind and the complex object, the redness. So here's a picture how you might think about this. You might have thought that a judgment fact should be a relationship between a judger and all of these relations. That's the picture that Russell wants you to get. That's different from a judger standing in a relation to, a dual kind of relation to something. So it is a correspondence to theory of truth, but there's no direct containment of the truth maker in the judgment fact if it's true. Again, no propositions, there are no negative facts, so you have a direct account of the distinction between truth and falsehood and of error, and no medium of representation figures in the analysis. So truth, as in Russell, always, was primarily a property of beliefs or judgment facts, and only derivatively one of sentences or statements. So here's Gödel's remark, which I was so struck by when we saw this transcription. Philosophical remark. Russell claims the proposition A believes BRC does not have the structure A believes BRC, but instead BRAC. What, however, is added or supervenes here in relation to all simple elementary propositions appears to be not a new form, but a new content. All propositions revert to the same form, that is the form of belief, but with another indication. And indeed, you've seen in Principia that this is the case. The definition of a judgment of perception is of this form at the base. Well, there are a lot of philosophical questions you could ask about this. So, I mean, it seems to me Russell is attempting to be somewhat critical here. What is the connection between the subject and the believed or judged sentence, if not that of the perception? However, something active. How is it possible that knowledge itself, which in fact first makes possible the foundation for our action, should itself already be in action? Those are good questions. Russell quotes from the Theaetetus in the 1940 William James lectures, parenthesis, it's no accident that Wittgenstein is discussing the Theaetetus. Here's Gödel. A thing can appear to be without being. How is that possible? He not only names, but also does something, binding the name with the verb, and this one calls thinking. Philosophical remark. The definition of truth is correct in the transcendent theory, but it must give an immanent truth criterion, and to this opposite, the transcendent definition must appear as a kind of useless tautology. So he's even thinking about the way in which the truth predicate can seem redundant, looked at from the point of view of the judgment of perception. Now, Russell testified in numerous places that it was Wittgenstein who had led him to believe that logic and, as of the second edition of Principia, in fact, all of mathematics consists of tautologies. As we've seen in Aki's slide about the axioms of choice and reducibility, Gödel strongly disagreed. He believed, I think, that some form of the MRTJ must hold generally and must hold for all of logic and mathematics, including those non-tautological axioms. And so my main picture of what's going on in that 1944 essay at the end in the speculative remarks that otherwise look like unbridled Platonism is he's trying to go back to Russell, and he's proposing that Russell return to the more general view given in Principia before the influence of Wittgenstein on the second edition. So now I'm just going to end with some history to kind of fill this out a bit because it's fun and because it's interesting. Russell was in serious contact with Schlick. Schlick was a big promoter of Russell's ideas. All the books are available there when Gödel was a student. He was already studying Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy in 1925. What's interesting to me is that even after proving incompleteness, we see Gödel checking Russell's books out of the library, always the ones that involve the multiple relation theory of truth. Moreover, Schlick is giving seminars devoted wholly to Russell. So the starred ones here are ones that I think we know that Gödel attended. The unstarred one, I can guess. So there's a whole seminar on the problems of philosophy in 1928-29, one on the analysis of mind, the analysis of matter in 29-30, Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy again in 32. In 1934-5, we know that Gödel attended Schlick's seminar, and Schlick there went through his general theory of knowledge in the second edition, and there is, of course, a section on what is truth in that book. Schlick himself emphasizes the following. He calls the MRTJ an ingenious theory in which truth is built up entirely out of differences that characterize various kinds of relations. So it's direct, right? He argues there that his own version of the correspondence theory is superior because, quote, it rests solely on the relation of pure coordination or correspondence, which is the simplest and most general of all relations. But of course, Schlick's theory of truth, like the Vienna Circle's theory of truth, is that you have general laws and then you interpret and fill those in as you have experiences so that you can provide designata for the names in your language. But notice, that view very easily tips over into a kind of conventionalism, as Gödel knew very well. So Schlick himself had noted that Russell's approach, on which you have the direct account of the distinction between truth and falsity at the base step on a particular judgment, and you ride on whatever richness is there, this we are sure Gödel knew by the early 30s. And I was very happy when I wrote to Vienna, and they gave me the information about which library slips. They kept writing back to me for a couple of weeks and saying, Professor Floyd, we're going to make your day. I kept writing and saying, did he check this book out at such and such a time? And I would get back the answer, yes, from the philosophical library. Which is quite wonderful for someone like me who likes archives. Okay, so 1932, there's a note longhand. Russell, philosophy of mind, problems of philosophy. So here he's framing a plan, but I'd like to emphasize the date there, 1932. He has just managed to finish his Habilitationsschrift and he's turned it in. And he's waiting for the committee to give their report. It's remarkable that he's now reading Russell again. 1932, in October, he also reads Analysis of Matter. So it's not only the books on truth, although the preface to Analysis of Matter already sets up the whole problem of the multiple relation theory in the course. I even found, this was good for me, he copied a particular excerpt from the Analysis of Matter into his notebook. Logical propositions say that two signs are only different ways of presenting the same thing to be expressed. This is on exactly the page where Russell says, Wittgenstein convinced me that all of mathematics is tautologous. So you can see young Gödel really mad about the influence that Wittgenstein is having toward a constructivist direction from his point of view on Russell. He borrowed Hurd's translation from the University Library in 32, January 33, February 33, after the Habilitationsschrift is defended. Now, in the Problems of Philosophy, it's very puzzling because Russell has a particular view there of the doctrine in which he thinks that somehow the judger synthesizes the object, or it's some kind of action. Now, Stout pointed out to him in a response, this won't work at all because you're just falling back onto the dual view of analysis. So you can't do that. And I'm guessing that Gödel was aware of this kind of a problem within that. He read the Analysis of Mind as well, where Russell comes finally, after years of resisting William James, to embrace anomalous monism, the view that mind and matter are two different ways of defining and describing things. And Gödel read that too. Lecture 13 is on truth and falsehood and thanks Wittgenstein for Russell's treatment of that duality of truth and falsehood. Incidentally, a copy was purchased for the IAS in 1940. Oh, the final thing is with neutral monism, once Russell adopts that, he gives up entirely on the idea that in order to understand a proposition, we have to be directly acquainted with each of its constituent parts. So neutral monism allows him more leeway there with regard to the constituents. So MaxPhil 17, this is a big conjecture. I mean, I have no idea. This is a just so story about a possible just so story. When Gödel says, if we could not perceive some concepts, we could not understand any single sentence, this is what's going on. It's not phenomenology, it's Russell. Now, there are various challenges to Russell's view when Russell attempts to work out an epistemology. Wittgenstein very famously pushed Russell on this in 1912 to 13, and in many ways you could argue that the Tractatus offers a kind of version of the multiple relation theory in which you subtract the subject from the possible structure. One objection Wittgenstein pressed is, if judgments and actual synthesis, don't we fall back into the old view? So Wittgenstein and Gödel construe it as analysis and synthesis, as does Russell himself as a result of Wittgenstein, by the analysis of mind. There's a problem about order of the terms in a relation. So how do you get the difference between Desdemona loving Cassio and Cassio loving Desdemona? Well, you have to take order, ordinals, order as primitive, or possible order as primitive. There's a problem about sense that Wittgenstein pushes. Russell is a kind of eliminativist about logical possibility. He doesn't want to talk about possibility and necessity. But Wittgenstein wants to push that notion in. Something has to already be logically possible or conceptually possible before we begin talking about ways in which it could be structured. I believe Gödel learned that in the Tractatus and adopts that as part of his view. Finally, there are reguess problems. Russell keeps trying to throw more forms into the complex. So Russell throws the form of dual relation into the loving picture to enlarge this thing. But of course, throwing more forms in is not going to actually help make sense of the epistemology from one point of view. And the idea here is that Wittgenstein and Gödel see form as the possibility of structure. So there's conceptual materials for making sense that are there that have to then be put together in such a way that they do make sense. Finally, interestingly, there's a negation. How do you get the idea that every proposition has a negation, that the law of the excluded nil appears, and how do you make sense of all these problems with internal and external scope? Russell never solves those problems. Largely, the Tractatus is, of course, devoted to trying to render answers to some of those questions. Now, with Gödel, we have to think about the infinite, though, because we're talking about transfinite order. And in 1912 to 13, Russell tried to, as I say, throw forms and complexes and gave up the epistemology in 1913. He tends to consider always the finite case, but he's always careful in all these texts, if you read them carefully, to leave open that reality may be infinitely complex. In other words, there could be complexes of infinite richness. You can't exclude that a priori. And Gödel would have noticed this reading Lecture 4 of Philosophy of Logical Atomism back here. After 1918, Russell accepts neutral monism, and I just would like to point out that when you do that, definability theory and the nature of language move to the fore in a way they had not before. You must be able to define and characterize structurally which kind of relations you're dealing with. Now I'm just going to end with really, really speculative things. So I'm about 50 minutes in. This is the Urprinzip. Okay. We go along, and this is page 63 or 4 of the MaxPhil notebook 9. We see Russell there scratching out reality, possibility. Truth is a relation, structure of objective concept. He's working hard at that base stuff. How is it that individual mathematical problems are soluble? Assumption of the existence of a systematic procedure, nota nota, this being the famous logical principle that would be predicated of the predicate and predicative subject. This Russellian idea, right? That anything you predicate of something could itself be turned into a subject or an object. Remark, philosophy. There is probably some concept that is just as precise as, or even more precise than mathematical concepts, and which contains the principle of every structuring of concepts, namely for all the concepts which originate not through abstraction from sense perceptions. That is, from it alone, if one had grasped it systematically, all concepts of the series after it would to some extent result from itself necessarily, together with all the relations holding between them. That would be the realizable constitution system. This concept, the original principle, is there a word for this in everyday language? Is it a relation concept? Would also have to have the following properties. Right? So he's looking for something that would provide a kind of metaphysical background for truth that would at least make sense of the idea of that picture I drew you with the construction of L down the middle, and gradually we're climbing up and reflecting down. The picture would be you have enough infinitary structure at the bottom that this reflection can go on sufficiently richly. To be precise, It must bring unity and order into present logical fundamental concepts. It must contain a method of tackling a problem. That is, a method provides for a goal or directs or describes the correct intelligent behavior. At least it makes sense of the idea of conceptual possibility, or what makes conceptual sense. That is, if one approaches another problem with this concept, a light must dawn over it. Any reader of uncertainty is, of course, struck by this figure of speech. Perhaps this concept is no unity, but a structure of concepts consisting of several concepts standing in connection with one another. So these are the manuscript background to that end of the 1944 paper, where you see him really about to make the turn to Leibniz. He immediately says, remark philosophy, one can say complete agreement. This is written in English. It's derived from Russell's Inquiry into Meaning and Truth, where Russell is talking about the potential for agreement and disagreement among subjects who speak solitary languages. But you can only in an improper sense say complete disagreement. This sounds comical. That seems to indicate that every two things are somehow one. Is that more than that every two things stand in some kind of relation? This hangs together with whether the world is reducible to one or two symmetric Urprinzip. So Gödel's problem, I think, here is, what about the negation of the Urprinzip? What happens if it doesn't hold? You can't seem to make sense of that. Is it false, or is it chaos? He somehow hasn't gotten the notion of truth to be conceptually clear all the way through within the parameters of this position that I've been attributing to him. So I want to speculate that the MRTJ, this infinitary version of the MRTJ, founders on the nature of negation and the law of excluded middle once again, just as Russell's earlier version had, and that this could be one way of thinking about why from this time onward Gödel reads Leibniz and Husserl demanding a general philosophical theory of concepts. He's never, of course, fully satisfied. And page 79 of MaxPhil 9 is this. My work in connection with philosophy should consist in an analysis of the highest concepts of logic and psychology, again following Russell. That is, what in the end is to be done is to write down a list of these concepts and the possible axioms, theorems, and definitions to be considered for them. Obviously, along with application to empirically given reality, you're supposed to take physics into account as a natural extension of your views. In order to enable this, one must first develop through half-understood philosophical readings and the writing down of philosophical remarks a feel for what one can accept. On the other hand, the understanding will be an axiomatic one, so as to increase the understanding of the philosophical writer. Thus, the interaction of top and bottom, where the right relation is important. So, I've offered you today some kind of reconstruction of what the right relation between top and bottom would be for Gödel within this overarching mathematical way in which he's taking the ordinals as given. And I think I'll just stop there. I haven't been able to get further with MaxPhil.